Amen. Well, praise God. We're going to get into the word this morning, and I want to talk about the Magi. And first of all, what a blessing. This is our last Sunday before Christmas. Next Sunday will actually be at Christmas. It'll be Christmas Day. And like Sue had said in the announcements, there will be a fellowship on Christmas Day, so that's available to you. So anyway, what I'd like to do, we're going to go to Matthew 2 and see the Magi. But I want to first go to Luke chapter 2, because the tradition is that the Magi were there at the birth of Christ, which they weren't. In fact, they weren't there for likely 2 years later than that. And so that's an important historical fact to be aware of. So in Luke chapter 2, when Christ is born, verse 21 says, when 8 days were completed for him to be circumcised, his name was called Jesus. And that's very Jewish. Even though the angel told Mary and Joseph what his name was going to be before he was even born, he was not officially named until the day he was circumcised. And so that was very Jewish. You got boys were named the day they were circumcised. So at 8 days old, he was called Jesus, the name he was called by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And then after the 8 days in the circumcision, then there's a period of time a woman went through of cleansing after the birth of a boy and a girl. After the birth of a boy, the period was 40 days. After the birth of a girl, it was 80 days. This is all spelled out in Leviticus chapter 12. And the woman would have to go to the local priest. In this case, Mary and Joseph were close enough to the temple. They were in Bethlehem, 7 miles away, walked the whole thing in less than a few hours. If you were way up in the Galilee or someplace, you could go to one of the Levitical cities where a priest was. But in this case, Mary and Joseph were close enough to Jerusalem. They went to the temple itself for the ceremonial cleansing. And it says, verse 23, just as it's written in the law of the Lord, every male that first opens the womb will be called holy to the Lord. So there was, so he's holy, verse 24, and to offer a sacrifice according to what it is said in the law of the Lord. And of course, the law of the Lord in this case is Leviticus 12. And then it says a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And it's very important that we understand that we could do this in Leviticus 12, but I don't want to take the time this morning to exegete Leviticus 12, but you can read it for yourself. It's pretty straightforward. It's very simple. You're supposed to bring a lamb. And if you can't afford a lamb, then you're allowed to bring 2 turtle doves or pigeons. And the fact that Mary and Joseph at this point in their life this is 40 days. This is not the night of Christ's birth. This is 40 days after Christ's birth, and they still can't even afford a lamb. So Joseph was a common laborer. He didn't make a lot of money, and they lived pretty much hand to mouth. And so they offered the offering that they were allowed to offer, 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Had the Magi already come and given them gold, frankincense, and myrrh, then they would not have been able to offer this sacrifice. So that having been said, let's go to Matthew chapter 2. We'll start right in verse 1. And the first thing we read in verse 1 says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying. So the text here, if we just slow down and read it, the Magi are arriving in Jerusalem after Jesus is born. So they can't be in Bethlehem the night he's born. They haven't even gotten to Jerusalem, and it's already after he's born. Then we kind of learn from the context that this is probably between 1.5 years and 2 years after Christ is born that these Magi arrive. And after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. And if you go back and you read Daniel, it says in Daniel chapter 3 that Daniel was made chief of the magicians. Daniel was chief over these guys, and the Magi generally are believed to be Zoroastrians, believed in Zoroastrianism. And there was a worship of fire and that kind of thing. There was in different permutations of Zoroastrianism, but for certain groups of them, they were very dualistic, much like Christians are. We have a good God, God the Father, and we have an evil adversary, the devil. And the Zoroastrians, many of them had a good God, and his name was Ahura Mazda, and they had an evil god named Ahriman. And of course, then, it's nice, it's fun, convenient, and true to blame evil on the evil god. But then you need somebody to get rid of the evil god. And so the Magi were waiting for a deliverer in the same way that you and I are waiting for Jesus Christ to come and deliver us from Satan. And so the Magian belief fit right in with what Daniel would have told them about the coming of the Messiah. The astounding thing is Daniel lived more than 500 years before Christ, which means that these guys, even if you allowed, passing information father to son every 50 years or so, you're talking at least 10 generations of people that are faithfully holding on to the truth. And there's something about that that's important, as Christians, and then as parts of family, and then if you have kids, as parents, you have a responsibility to see if you can communicate the truth, particularly to your family. And the Magi obviously did that, and did that successfully for over 500 years. And that is a really wonderful testimony to faithfulness and the value of truth and the value of hope. I mean, we've been believing that Jesus Christ is going to come back for 2,000 years now. So it wasn't, you think about that. Okay, so the Magi were waiting for a savior to come and deliver them from evil for over 500 years. And then whatever they were looking for in the stars, however, and there are different theories and stuff, and we think we've got a pretty good idea of what it might have been, but the Bible just doesn't say. So when they saw this stellar configuration of the planets and stars and things, then they believed that the Messiah had been born in Judea. And so they started out and headed there. And, I'd like to share my screen. Let's go to a map. And you should now be looking at, are you looking at the map where my hand is?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep, good deal. Okay, well, we believe, especially based on the fact that the Magi says the Magi were from the east, because the Magi, their native home territory was in this area here, which was historic Babylonia. And this was their historic hometown, if you will, or home area. Although by the time of Christ, they had scattered. There was a group of them down here in Egypt. There was some that had morphed over into Turkey and even into Greece. But these particular Magi, it says Magi arrived from the east. And because of that, we believe they were here in Babylon. And so they're going to make the journey. They see what they needed to see in the sky. They're going to make the journey to Jerusalem. Now, Ezra made the same journey in Ezra chapter 7, verse 9, and it took 4 months. The Magi are going to make this journey, and it would probably take at least that long. A good solid 4 months, maybe more. So there's a genuine investment of time and energy, not to mention the money and the gifts and that kind of thing. But there's also a level of danger in the travel. And I think this is one of the things that we've got to really appreciate. When we're talking about the people traveling, it wasn't like today where you get in a car and you travel and you're pretty safe. Remember, in the ancient world, there weren't any police forces. And as you're traveling from Babylon all this way, there's all these different tribes and all these little nations until you reach the Roman Empire. When you reach the Roman Empire, then the Roman soldiers came over, but frankly, they could be pretty greedy within themselves. And the Roman soldiers, their main job was to make sure the empire was calm enough that taxes could be collected, and to make sure that the roads were open for official travel. So again, so there was commerce and travel. They never considered themselves a police force. so that if you got robbed along the way, you went and found a Roman soldier and complained to him. He just, so well, you want me to do it? I'm not going to keep you safe, mister. And everybody knew that. They understood that. And one of the things that is so foreign to us because of our Protestant work ethic, if you will, the idea that we believe that God designed us to want to work with our hands and make money and be honest. Honesty in a way of making money is a cultural thing. There's entire cultures that don't feel the same way at all about honesty and about making money. And this is certainly true in the ancient Near East, and different people write about this. Now, this is Thompson's book, The Land in the Book. And he writes about, and by the way, Thompson's just one customs book. It's very, very good. But what I'm going to read you here, you can read in any one of a dozen of customs books that were written in the 1800s, 1700s, where people have had personal experiences like this. So here's Thompson, and he's riding along with an Arab who's been assigned to him by the sheik to protect him. And the Arab is kind of muttering about the fact that that very morning, the sheik had sent out a marauding raiding band to look for people to steal from. And the reason that this guy riding with Thompson is kind of muttering is because he wanted to be part of it. He says, one of these horsemen was very talkative, and among other matters stated without the least reserve that he wanted to have accompanied the marauding expedition, which we encountered in the morning, but the sheik wouldn't let him. and so Thompson says to the guy, now they're riding horses side by side. Thompson says to the guy, if you had met me, would you have assisted to plunder me? The man says, certainly. You would rob your brother? Oh, well, you wouldn't have been my brother then. He goes on, he says, my talkative brother glorified in the title of robber. And when I asked him why they did not cultivate the rich valley of the Jordan, he curled his lips in disdain and exclaimed, what? A Bedouin drive the plow? It's Sufar Allah. God forbid. We are robbers. And striking his terrible spear fiercely into the ground, he said, this is our trade, and by this we will live, or voila, by this we will die. So that's, you want to know how this whole tribe makes their living? Robbing people. And that's not unusual. This is so hard for us to grasp, but this is not unusual. So you're going to travel with gold, frankincense, and myrrh from over here in Babylon, make the 600 or so mile trip past all these marauding tribes, any one of which is willing to attack you. And so as a result, when the people put caravans together with trading goods, I mean, nobody wants to send their goods from, say, Babylonia or even parts beyond India, Pakistan. Nobody wants to send their goods over to Jerusalem, which you'd go through Damascus, you'd trade there, you'd go through Jerusalem, you'd trade there. You'd go down into Egypt, you trade there, and then you bring goods back. Nobody wants to do that if all it's going to do is get stolen. So what did they do? They traveled in huge groups. And even in historic memory, you can check this out on encyclopediabritannica.com. There have been trading camel caravans. 10,000 camels was pretty common. 20,000 camels was known. So these caravans are just gigantic. So that's what would have happened between here and here. There would have been a gigantic camel caravan. And if we understand that, that helps us understand the Magi. I'll stop sharing my screen. So the Magi from the east arrive, and they say, verse 2, where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to pay homage to him. Now, verse 2 contains an interesting truth that would have set Herod on his ear, because when they arrive at Jerusalem, they say, where is he who's been born King of the Jews? And I confess I read this for years and didn't pay any attention to it until Bill Schlegel pointed it out to me and said, John, Herod wasn't born king of the Jews. And that's, I know, synesis, when facts come together, King Herod wasn't, first of all, he wasn't a Jew. He was an Idumean, which means he came from the area of Edom. And he was appointed king by the Roman Senate. He was not born a king. The prophecies of the Old Testament were that there would be someone, the Messiah, who would be born king. Because if you're sitting on Herod's throne at this time, remember that there hasn't been a legitimate king of Israel, a descendant of David, on the throne of David since the Babylonian captivity. It's been basically 580-ish years since there's been a king on the throne of David, a king who was born for that position. So now the Magi show up and they don't say, where's the king? They say, where is he that's been born king of the Jews? And then we saw his star when it rose, which meant they saw his star on the horizon. They were astronomers. That's where they looked. They measured stars on the horizon line, and we've come to pay homage to him. So verse 3, now when Herod the king heard this, he was deeply troubled. No kidding. Herod was really threatened by anybody that might want to take over his position. In fact, take almost anything from him. He would be very threatened by this. And the one who was going to be born king of the Jews would be the Messiah and the legitimate ruler. And Herod would know from the prophecies and what he had heard that when the Messiah came, then the Messiah would kill the wicked and take over. So when Herod heard the Magi show up and say, where is he that's been born king of the Jews? Yeah, well, Herod's deeply troubled and all Jerusalem with him. By the way, one of the reasons that Herod would be troubled and all Jerusalem with him is because when the Magi become part of this huge camel caravan that's coming from parts of Babylonia, they've been on the road for months, thousands of camels. We don't know how many Magi were in the caravan, but you can bet there were, I would say there were probably at least a couple dozen, maybe several dozen, maybe even a few more, because you've got two problems. Obviously, if you're carrying that kind of wealth, you've got danger of attack from the outside in. You've got, the robbers and things that will try to come into your camp at night and steal things. But also in a caravan that large, it's made up of a very eclectic group of people. And they don't necessarily like each other. They don't necessarily know each other. They're traveling together for one reason, safety. That's it. Safety from outside attack. That's the reason they're traveling together. So if you are just a few people and you're vulnerable, there's absolutely no reason within that caravan that some people are going to come over and beat you up and take your stuff or take some of your stuff and run off with it. And like I say, and then who do you report that to? You think you call the caravan police? There's no police. There's just, you are responsible to protect your stuff, period. And so the amount of muscle that you had to bring with you was directly proportional to the desire of your stuff, if you will, how much people would like your stuff. So I'm sure there were probably at least, I can't be sure, but I would think there'd be at least several dozen Magi. And that would be another reason that Herod would be troubled, and Jerusalem. They're like, wow, these guys are serious. Look, they showed up with this huge group. So verse 4, and gathering together all the high priests and experts in the law from among the people here, capital P, this is the Jews, he inquired of them where the Christ would be born. Why is he looking for the Christ? Why doesn't it say he inquired of them where the next king might be born, or a king might be born, or a king of the Jews might be born? What was it that triggered Herod to realize this was about the Christ? And the answer, of course, is the word born. Because, like I say, there had been a legitimate king on the throne of David for over 500 years, actually closer to 580. So all of a sudden, he gets it. This is going to be the Messiah. And he says, where is the Christ going to be born? Verse 5. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, because this is what was written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. My voice is getting a little rough. I hope that doesn't bother you. It doesn't bother me. But in any case, by the way, there's something really neat here in the translation of verse 5, because the religious leaders come to Herod and they say he's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea, because that's what's been written by the prophet. But then the prophecy is, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. See, at the time Micah was writing, excuse me, this quotation is from Micah 5:2. At the time Micah was writing, the tribal area of Judah was intact. Joshua divided the land into the 12 tribal areas. Each tribe got an area. Judah got a tribe. The prophecy in Micah was that Christ would come out of the tribal area of Judah. There's a good chance that Herod may not even really have realized what the tribal area of Judah was, what the boundaries were, because at the time of Herod, the tribal area of Judah was gone. The Roman government had shifted things and messed with things. And so now you had Judea in the south and Samaria in the north and Galilee north of that. So the religious leaders are speaking in terms that Herod could understand. They properly quoted Micah, that it was Bethlehem of Judah, but they talked to Herod in terms that he could understand, Bethlehem of Judea. And the reason it was important to point that out was because there was a Bethlehem in Galilee. In the tribe of Zebulun, there was another town named Bethlehem. So that's why he says the prophecy was Bethlehem in the land of Judah. You're by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. And when it talks about that, a leader who will shepherd my people Israel, you need to go back into the prophecy of the Messiah, that the Messiah was called a shepherd, that he would even shepherd the nations, that type of thing. By the way, that prophecy also about Christ shepherding the people also appears in the book of Revelation. So they said, they told Herod, well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem of Judah, Bethlehem of Judea. And so verse 7, then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the time when the star appeared. I'm not super happy with the translation time. I mean, I understand it's a good translation, but there's two Greek words for time. One is kairos and one is chronos. We get our word chronology from the word chronos. Kairos is a point in time, a designated time, an appointed time, a specific time. Chronos is generally speaking a time frame. So this is hard to explain in English, because in English, if you want to say point in time, you kind of have to say point in time. But the Greeks had two words, and in here it's chronos. So you can almost translate this as Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the chronology when the star appeared. What was going on? What happened? Because as we see when they're going to Bethlehem, the star still pops up in the sky. So he finds out the chronology. And why did he need to know that? Because he's got a plot where he's going to kill the Messiah. So he's got to know what he's looking for. How old is this baby? But he knows that at least it's going to be in Bethlehem. Verse 8, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the child. And as soon as you find him, report back to me so that I can come and pay homage to him as well. And notice, Herod's urgency kind of bleeds through the text here. As soon as you find him. Herod wanted to jump on this. He was a man of action. He was not going to wait around and play games here. He's going to go after the Messiah as soon as he finds him. So verse 8, he sent them to Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is about 7 miles dead south of Jerusalem. That becomes important in what happens next, because when they're going from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, then they're looking south, they're looking into the southern sky. And as the stars move from horizon to horizon, rising, standing, and setting, then they're going to see the stars in the skies ahead of them, and that becomes important. So verse 8, he said, go to Bethlehem, go to search diligently for the child, and then when you find him, bring me back word so I can pay homage, which of course is a lie, and Herod was a giant liar. There's probably a mini lesson in that evil people lie, that's what they do. Frankly, I'm astounded at the number of people that trust evil people. It's foolish. Evil people lie. They lie all the way through the scripture, and they're not to be trusted. And the wise men, the Magi here, were very, very smart, very astute, not to trust Herod at all. Frankly, Herod's reputation probably preceded him. Herod had his wife executed, his wife's mother executed. He had killed off at least one of his children by this time. He had killed a whole bunch of people he thought were political rivals. He had killed so many people that Caesar Augustus is reported as saying, I would rather be Herod's pig than his friend, because his pigs live. Herod, pretending to be a Jew, wouldn't eat pork. So Herod's pigs stayed alive, but his friends, unfortunately, died. A lot of his close friends died. So that's the kind of reputation that Herod had. So it says, verse 9, after listening to King Herod, the Magi went on their way. Now, where were they going? They were going to Bethlehem. They were going south. And look, the star that they had seen when it rose, so the star they had first seen in the east, was going ahead of them until it came and stood over where the child was. And that's the way, if you've ever traveled and looked at the night sky, it seems to move ahead of you. And that's basically what's going on here. The star is in the southern sky. It's going up as you're going south. And then in astronomical terms, it rises and then it stands and then it would set. But apparently, as they got to Bethlehem, the sun was out. Now, the question would be, if you take a look at this and just reading it, verse 9, they went on their way, and look, the star that they had seen when it rose. Okay, that's going to be months earlier, because they said we saw its star when it rose, and now we've come to worship him. So they had at least a 4-month journey to get to Jerusalem. So this is saying the star we saw 4 months ago, we now see in the southern sky. And the question is, the stars are in the sky. Why didn't they see it when they were traveling to Jerusalem? And the Bible doesn't say, but I suspect it's because they were traveling with a large caravan and they were traveling during the daytime. And if they were traveling during the daytime, then they wouldn't have seen that star, or there may be other astronomical reasons as well. So anyway, but now when they're headed south, the star that they had seen many months ago was going ahead of them until it came and stood over where the child was. Of course, obviously, a star can't point out a house. So what's it going to stand over? It's going to stand over the town of Bethlehem. And they were going there anyway. So they go there in verse 10, by the way, and seeing the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Just because to them that was a sign that God's blessing was on their journey, that they were doing the right thing. Verse 11, and when they came to the house, well, here they are, now they're arriving at a house. And the question would be, how did they know which house to go to in Bethlehem? Well, historic memories are really long in the ancient Near East. And the shepherds had told everybody that this was the Christ. And so people would remember. And if the Magi showed up and said, where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? The people in Bethlehem would remember, and they'd be able to point the Magi to the right house. By the way, I should have pointed out, let's see. Yeah, when it came to the age of Christ, even Herod doesn't call Jesus a baby. Look at verse 8 again. I meant to point this out because Herod sent the Magi to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the child. So by the time the Magi arrived, Christ was a child. So verse 11, they come to the house, which would have been pointed out to them by the people in Bethlehem. They saw the child with Mary, his mother, and falling down to their knees, they paid homage to him. And after opening their treasure boxes, they presented gifts to him, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, they may have presented more gifts. One gift that I feel fairly certain they would have had to have given to Joseph and Mary, because if you remember now, up until this very minute, Joseph and Mary are so poor, they can't afford to buy a lamb. Now they're going to get gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And it's going to be later that night that an angel's going to show up and say, go to Egypt. So there's no way Joseph is going to be able to put all their household belongings on his back, along with gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and go to Egypt. So I feel fairly certain that one of the gifts that the Magi would have given to Joseph and Mary would have been a donkey, even if they just thought even if they had no idea about what God's plan for getting out of town was, although they may have suspected it, knowing Herod. When Herod said, go and find him and report back to me, the Magi may well have suspected that Herod would go and search for the child, and they may have said, look, we're going to leave you a couple donkeys so you can get out of here. We think you're going to leave. I can't prove that from the text, but I know for a fact that Joseph did not pick up gold, frankincense, and myrrh and all the stuff that a young family needs and carry them on his back to Egypt, which is about 200 miles away. So that brings up an interesting point that, the Bible tells us what we need to know and what we can know from logic. Then we need to extrapolate that. It's like Isaiah says, when God said in Isaiah, come, let us reason together, says Yahweh. We've got to use our minds and reason to put together the word. So they come into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, falling down to their knees. They paid homage to him, and opening their treasure boxes, they presented gifts to him, gold and frankincense and myrrh. A couple things about the treasure boxes. The REB has treasure boxes. The Greek word is a word for something that contains something else. Some of the versions say treasure bags, and they may well have been bags. We put treasure boxes, and they may well have been boxes. Some versions have treasure chests. I think that's kind of overstating it. When I think about a treasure chest, guess what I think about? Does somebody say pirates? Arg, And so remember that if you're carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh, you want to be fairly discreet, so that you don't end up dead and missing your stuff. So carrying something huge like a pirate's treasure chest is not the way to be discreet. So these would have been like small boxes. This is a case where it's better to pack more parcels that are smaller, especially something like gold, which is ridiculously heavy. You don't want to give Joseph a treasure box of gold that's so heavy you can't even lift it. It's better to give, make smaller bundles so that they can carry the stuff, and also so you can conceal it better, which is what the Magi would have wanted to do with their treasure. So they opened their treasure boxes, or bags of treasure, if you will, and presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And I don't need to tell you that it's the three gifts is why historically there were said to be three Magi. By the way, the tradition of three magi appears to go all the way back to Origen, the church father Origen, who was a pre-Nicene father. Interestingly enough, when we talk about how sticky these traditions are and how hard they are to get rid of, men of no less caliber than John Calvin and Zwingli during the Reformation tried to convince the church that there weren't three, and they couldn't do it. So when you're facing, deeply entrenched tradition, it can be really, really difficult to shake it. But anyway, so these guys present gifts to them: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And then, I'll talk about that in a second. Then verse 12, and having been instructed by God in a dream not to return to Herod, they returned to their country by a different road. By the way, verse 12 can be difficult to translate in English because the Greek word, when it says having been instructed by God, the Greek word indicates that the gods were first asked. It's a Greek word that was used when a Greek would go to an oracle, like the oracle at Delphi, and ask a question and then get an answer back. Now, this tells me that it's not like the Magi were gonna just go back to Herod or something, and then they were instructed by God. They were suspicious of Herod. They knew his reputation. At some point, they asked God, okay, God, this is our promised Messiah. Obviously, he's not in a position to defend himself against Herod. What do we do here? And so the Magi had petitioned God, what do you want us to do? And that is great wisdom on their part. And then God answers and instructs them in a dream, don't go back to Herod. And so, so they went home, they went back to Babylon by a different road. And I want to go back to the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gold we understand. The frankincense and myrrh are not nearly as well understood. And this is where, when something was common or it was just so well known that you didn't have to talk about it because everybody knew it, the ancient world, whenever you got close to a city, it stunk. And frankly, many times along the side of the road, it stunk. There was just the cities were a complete mess. And it's astounding. I wish I could remember, there's things happen to me during my life that I don't write down, so I don't exactly know when it was. But on one of my tours of Israel, we were in Jordan, and we were going down the road, and there was a dead camel on the side of the road. And oh my gosh, you could smell it. I won't say a mile away because that would be an exaggeration. But, as you began to get close to it, it really stunk. And the ancient world, with things died, they pretty much just left them there. There's a pretty interesting book out, Daily Life in a Roman City. I'd like to read a little bit because this explains why the frankincense and the myrrh were so valuable. And they were massively used. These types of incense were used massively all over the ancient world, and not just in temples. People are used to the fact, well, didn't they burn a lot of incense to their gods? Well, yeah, because they wanted the god's temple to smell good. But the fact of the matter is, most everybody who could afford it burned incense at home. So this is Gregory Aldredi. Gregory Aldredi. He says, the streets of Rome were breeding grounds for numerous disease-causing organisms due to the widespread presence of human and animal cadavers in various states of decomposition, as well as the copious quantities of raw sewage deposited in the streets. Okay, the normal course of events produced enormous numbers of dead bodies, many of which were not disposed of. The truly impoverished who could not afford to join a burial club or who lacked nearby family members to cremate or bury their bodies, along with Rome's large population of homeless people and beggars, simply lay where they dropped, or else they were thrown into the Tiber or open pits just outside the city. It's been estimated that the city of Rome produced perhaps 1,500 such unclaimed bodies a year. Now divide that by 300, and you're dealing with a number of dead bodies somewhere around the city every single day. A number of literary anecdotes vividly illustrates the presence of both bodies and scavenging animals in the streets of the city. The poet Martial describes the gruesome death of a beggar whose last moments are spent trying to fend off the dogs and vultures that have gathered to feed on him. Suetonius mentions an incident when a stray dog ran into the room where the Emperor Vespasian was eating and deposited a human hand beneath the table. And a partially eaten corpse was hauled through the Roman Forum itself by a pack of scavenging canines. And then he goes on that's just dead bodies. So you have dead human bodies, you have dead animal bodies, then you got the sewage. So you have human sewage, of course, and it's thrown out. Then you have animal waste because all these dogs and cats and rats, they're all pooping. And so that's all over the streets. And he goes on to write, he says, the sewage, garbage and sewage seems to have ended up in the streets. It was no small problem since at its height, Rome's human inhabitants were producing over 100,000 pounds of excrement every day. I mean, that is an immense amount. You can take your city, throw 100,000 pounds of human excrement into the city, and then add dog excrement. It goes on. The world stunk. That was the bottom line. The cities of the ancient world stunk. And if we get that picture, then we're in a better position to understand why the incense was so valuable. It was light, it was portable, it was incredibly easily traded, and everybody wanted some. So this really was an amazingly wonderful gift to give somebody. So verse 11 then, when they came into the house, when the Magi came into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, falling down to their knees. They paid homage to him, and after opening their treasure boxes, they presented gifts to him, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Then they were instructed in a dream not to return to Herod, so they returned by a different road. Verse 13, now after they departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and stay there until I tell you, because Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Now, some things we ought to know about this, just basically from the culture. Herod had spies everywhere. I mean, he was hyper paranoid. And it's not going to take him any time at all to find out that the Magi aren't coming back to talk to him about where the Christ child is. So the angel is going to tell Mary, or going to tell Joseph, pick up your young family and get out of town and do it now. But think about that. If Herod's got spies everywhere and Joseph sleeps in, 9:30, 10 o'clock, he gets up, looks at Mary, hey, time to load the donkey, we got to get out of town. Who's going to see him leave? Everybody. Thank you, Craig. Yeah, everybody is going to see him leave. And so when Herod's chasing him down, Herod's going to do exactly what Pharaoh did with Moses. He's going to load up his chariots and he's going to say, let's go get him. So, what's got to happen is Joseph and Mary have to disappear. It's like, well, they were here yesterday. Well, we don't really know what happened to them, whatever. And so that's why the angel comes and appears to Joseph in a dream at night. And notice, and he says, and I love the Greek text as the imperative, get up. I don't know how old Joseph was, but it's like, get up. We're not goofing around here. Get your tail out of bed, take the child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, because those who were seeking his life have died. And so he ends up going to Egypt. Did I get that right? And going to the land of Israel. Okay. So he went and left. And of course, basically the townspeople, when Herod figured it out the next day, and they'd say, where are Joseph and Mary and stuff? We don't really know. And nobody really would have thought, I don't think, that they would have tried to make a 200-mile journey to Egypt, I think it would be more likely that they would think that he's hiding in some house around here, and they probably waste a fair amount of time looking around the local area. But anyway, verse 21, so Joseph gets up, takes the child and his mother, went into the land of Israel, verse 22. But when he had heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Instead, being instructed by God in a dream, he departed to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth. So that's how Joseph then is allowed, or keeps on being able to raise the Christ child. What's missing in here is that, it's not missing, I'm sorry, in verse 19. Now, after Herod had died, I skipped a section, didn't I? I was sitting there going, this isn't coming together, but I skipped it. They returned by a different road in verse 12. Then the angel appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, get up, take the father and mother and flee to Egypt and stay there till I tell you. My apologies. That was what I was missing. I skipped down and to the dream in verse 19, but I missed the dream that I meant to pick up in verse 13. My apologies. So he gets up, verse 14, and he takes them during the night and departed for Egypt. That's what I was looking for. So he got out under the cover of darkness when nobody noticed. And that's how he got out of town without people knowing exactly what happened. He went to Egypt, stayed there until the death of Herod. Herod, meanwhile, verse 16, when he realized he'd been tricked by the Magi, he was furious, of course. He was furious, yes. Probably frightened as well, because if the Christ child was still alive, then the throne was still in a position to be occupied by the legitimate ruler, and he would be out of the way. So he became furious, and he killed all the male children that were in Bethlehem and the surrounding region from 2 years old and under, based on the timing that he had found out from the Magi. So the Magi were, the timing would have been somewhere around the 2-year period. Verse 17, then what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, a sound was heard in Ramah, sobbing and great mourning. Rachel was crying for her children, and she did not want to be comforted because they are no more. And of course, the children were killed. And unpacking that prophecy is important and valuable as well. And then Herod died in verse 19, and the angel tells Joseph, get up, take the child, and go into the land of Israel. And that was what was confusing me. I was like, it should have said Egypt. It did say Egypt. I skipped the section. Go into the land of Israel, meaning go back to Israel. And then he went back to Nazareth and raised baby Jesus. So the Magi is a really, really important point here in the story, because not only did they recognize Christ as the true king, but they themselves demonstrated wonderful faithfulness in observing and waiting, being patient for the centuries while the Christ child wasn't coming. The journey that they took, the personal danger they were willing to go to be able to worship the child in person and meet the actual Christ child, the Savior of the world, in person, as a wonderful, wonderful model for us. And then the fact that the money, basically the portable wealth, if you will, that they gave Joseph and Mary and Jesus, I'm sure positioned Joseph very well to raise the Christ child in a way that he would be exposed to the scrolls and the things that he needed to be able to best step forward into his ministry. So guys, thank you for being with me on this Sunday before Christmas.